In a restaurant filled with the city's elite, a cruel billionaire tried to break a waitress's spirit by throwing a $100 tip on the floor like trash. But her quiet, unexpected reaction did not just win the respect of the entire room. It brought the powerful man to his knees, making him beg for her forgiveness in a spectacle no one would ever forget. Before we start, your support means everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. In the dazzling, sunlit dining room of the Aurelia, the world felt suspended in amber. Light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, striking the constellation of crystal glasses on each table and scattering tiny, fleeting rainbows across the pristine white linens. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine porcelain was a gentle, hypnotic melody, the only sound that dared to rise above the hallowed, confidential murmurs of the city's elite. This was a room built for comfort, for the celebration of effortless wealth, a sanctuary where the harsh realities of the outside world were not permitted to enter. Clara moved through this golden space with an almost invisible efficiency. To the patrons, she was a seamless part of the ambiance, a quiet figure of professional poise, her dark uniform immaculate, her expression serene as she offered the wine list. She refilled a water glass with a steady hand, her movements economical and graceful, a ballet of silent service that she had perfected over 2 long years. But beneath this placid surface, Clara was a storm of raw, tightly coiled anxiety. The serene atmosphere was a daily torture, a beautiful, polished mask held over the face of her grim reality. Internally, she carried the crushing physical weight of her younger sister's mounting medical bills. Each new envelope on her tiny kitchen table felt like another stone added to her pockets, pulling her deeper into a cold sea of desperation. Maya, her brilliant, funny younger sister, her only family, was fading. The experimental treatments were their only hope, a slim thread to cling to, and they cost more than Clara could make in a year, or even 10. The contrast was a cruel, daily joke. Here, she served men who complained about the temperature of wine that cost $2,000 a bottle, a sum that could pay for an entire month of Maya's life-saving medication. She smiled politely, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality, as they discussed million-dollar deals and casual trips to Paris. She had to listen to them debate the merits of a new yacht, all while she was internally calculating if she could skip meals for the next 3 weeks to afford Maya's next prescription. This opulent, sun-drenched room, with its air of serene, old-world luxury, was a different planet from her cramped, cold apartment, where the only sound was the rhythmic, worrying beep of a second-hand medical monitor. This job was her only chance, her last stand against the financial abyss threatening to swallow her and her sister whole. Her poise was not just professionalism, it was armor. It was the only thing holding her together. If she let one crack show, if her hand trembled while pouring a vintage Bordeaux, if her smile faltered for even a second, she might lose this lifeline. So she breathed in the cloying scent of expensive perfume and fresh-cut flowers, and she pushed her own terror down, one table at a time, a ghost in a palace, praying for a miracle. The serene bubble of the Aurelia burst when the grand oak doors swung open, not with a gentle push, but with a force that sent a shiver through the dining room. A frigid gust of city air followed, carrying with it a man who seemed to be the source of the chill. Alistair Finch had arrived. He was a man whose name was a weapon in boardrooms, a notorious tech billionaire known for his brutal, scorched-earth business tactics and a temper that was the stuff of legend among the city's service staff. He was not loud. He was worse. He moved with a heavy, magnetic disdain, as if the very act of walking on the plush carpet was beneath him. The restaurant's quiet melody didn't just stop. It tensed. Conversations faltered, forks paused halfway to mouths, and a collective, unspoken anxiety rippled through the room. Alistair Finch, dressed in a bespoke suit so dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight, scanned the room with a look of profound boredom, his eyes sweeping over the other patrons as if they were livestock, and he was disappointed with the auction. The head waiter, a man who had seated royalty without flinching, visibly paled, his professional smile tightening into a grimace. He glided over, his posture one of deep, practiced submission. Clara felt her stomach clench. She had hoped, prayed, that he would be seated across the room in someone else's section. But the head waiter, perhaps sensing her unflappable composure or simply needing his most capable soldier for this battle, was leading the billionaire directly toward her. He was seated at the best table, the one with the panoramic view of the park, a view he immediately ignored. He tossed his overcoat onto an adjacent chair, a $5,000 piece of cashmere landing in a careless heap. Clara approached, her training kicking in, a shield against the palpable aura of aggressive power radiating from him. "Good afternoon, sir. May I offer you some water?" He did not look at her. He did not even acknowledge her presence. His attention was on his phone, his thumb scrolling with impatient, angry movements. He simply raised one finger, a curt, dismissive gesture that meant one thing: stop talking. Clara stood in silence, her body perfectly still, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She was a ghost to him, a function, not a person. After a full minute that stretched into an eternity, he finally snapped his phone shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room, and looked at the menu, his distaste obvious. His very presence was an insult, a declaration that nothing and no one in this room, especially not the help, was worthy of his time. Clara's heart hammered, but her hands remained steady. This was the man who could end her world with a single complaint. The performance of cruelty began almost immediately, a one-man show for an audience he held in contempt. Clara returned with a silver pitcher, the water chilled and filtered, pouring it into a crystal glass so thin it was barely there. Alistair Finch raised the glass, did not drink, and set it down with an audible click that sliced through the dining room's hush. "Is this tap water?" he asked, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the park outside, not even affording her the dignity of eye contact. "No, sir. It is our triple-filtered mineral water," Clara replied, her voice a calm, even murmur, a practiced note of professional placidity. He waved his hand in a short, violent dismissal. "It has a taste, a chemical taste. Bring me a bottle of the Voss, and make sure it is sealed when it arrives." When his appetizer arrived, a delicate, towering construction of seared scallops and microgreens, he poked at it once with his fork before pushing the entire plate away. Rubbery. A child could do better. His main course, the Aurelia's famous 30-day dry-aged ribeye, a masterpiece of culinary art cooked to a perfect medium rare, met a similar, tragic fate. He sawed at it with theatrical effort, took one small bite, chewed it with obvious disgust, and then placed his heavy silver utensils down with a clang. "This is shoe leather. Are you actively trying to poison me, or is the chef just incompetent?" Each complaint was a small, sharp blade, not designed to correct an error, but simply to cut, to provoke, to remind her of her station. Clara's emotions were a tight, hot knot in her stomach, a sickening, swirling mix of personal anger and profound public humiliation. This man, in his $10,000 suit, was treating her like an animal, a thing, and he was doing it for sport, but her actions, her body, remained a fortress of impeccable professionalism. "Yes, sir. I will have the chef prepare another one for you immediately." Her voice never wavered. Her smile, a small, polite, and utterly false expression, never faltered. And this, her calm, unshakable poise, seemed to irritate him more than any tearful outburst could have. He wanted her to cry, he wanted her to yell, to argue, to break. Her stubborn refusal to shatter, her quiet, infuriating dignity, was an act of defiance he could not tolerate. He wanted to prove that everyone, especially a little waitress, could be broken, that everyone had a price, that his money made him a god. Her composure was a mirror, reflecting his own monstrous ugliness back at him, and he hated her for it. As she returned with the second, flawless steak, he did not even thank her. He just gestured for her to leave his sight. He then turned to his companion, a nervous-looking younger man who had not spoken a word, and remarked, his voice rising, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "Is it so hard to get decent service in this city? You pay an absolute fortune for a meal, and they hire people who clearly do not know the first thing about fine dining." Clara heard him. The entire room heard him. The insult landed, public and sharp as glass. She felt the hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, her spine straightening. She thought of Maya's pale face, of the ticking clock, of the stack of white envelopes on her table. She would not break. The meal concluded not with a satisfied sigh, but with a palpable sense of relief from the surrounding staff, a marathon of anxiety finally over. Clara moved forward to clear the last of the dessert plates, her movements as fluid and composed as they had been 2 hours ago, though her nerves were shredded thin. She placed the small, dark leather billfold discreetly on the table, just to the left of Alistair Finch's hand, a silent, final gesture. "Thank you for dining with us, sir." She said it with the same quiet dignity she had maintained through his barrage of insults, her voice a soft, even tone that refused to betray the exhaustion and humiliation simmering beneath her calm exterior. This, the final step, should have been the end of the brutal interaction. She would turn, walk away, and he would disappear from her life forever, leaving behind only the bitter memory of his cruelty. Alistair Finch, however, was not finished with his performance. He glanced down at the bill, a small slip of paper that represented a sum he would not even notice missing, and he scoffed. It was a sharp, ugly, guttural sound of derision that seemed to tear a hole in the restaurant's fragile, peaceful ambience. He let the billfold sit there, a silent, obnoxious testament to his displeasure, making Clara wait, forcing her to stand at attention by his table like a statue, a subordinate awaiting dismissal. He reached slowly, deliberately, into the inner pocket of his bespoke jacket. He did not pull out a sleek, black credit card. He pulled out a single, crisp, $100 bill. Clara's heart, which had just begun to slow, started to pound a heavy, sick rhythm against her ribs. He held the bill between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up just long enough for her and the adjacent tables to see it. It was, by any normal standard, an extraordinarily generous tip, far more than 20%, a wave of confusion, and perhaps a tiny, naive spark of hope flickered in Clara. Had she misjudged him? Had he finally recognized her unflappable service? But then his expression hardened, his eyes, cold and reptilian, finally met hers, locking her in their gaze. He held her stare as his other fingers began to close, purposefully, slowly, crushing the note. He squeezed it tightly, his knuckles whitening, turning the symbol of her labor, of her value, into a tight, pathetic ball of green paper. And then, with a casual, dismissive flick of his wrist, as if discarding a piece of trash, a napkin he had wiped his mouth with, he tossed the crumpled $100 bill onto the floor. It landed with a soft, insignificant scuff on the pristine white marble, just inches from the toe of her sensible black shoe. A hush, absolute and suffocating, fell over the dining room. It was not a polite silence. It was a vacuum, a collective, sharp intake of breath from every patron. Conversations ceased mid-word. Silverware stopped its gentle journey. All eyes, every single one, fixed on the small, pathetic wad of cash lying on the floor, and then, inevitably, on the still, silent figure of the waitress forced to confront it. Alistair Finch leaned back in his chair. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his lips. This was his checkmate. He had finally found a way to shatter her infuriating composure. He had turned her need for money, which he could smell on her like cheap perfume, into a public spectacle of humiliation. His eyes were bright with a predator's satisfaction. The entire room was his stage, and he waited, luxuriating in the agonizing tension, for the final act. He waited for her to bend. He waited for her to stoop, to grovel, to pick up his demeaning, dirty charity from the floor. This single act would validate everything he believed about the world. That everyone, no matter how dignified, would eventually kneel for money. The silence in the Aurelia was no longer polite. It was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the entire room. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was frozen in place, a tableau of suspended disbelief. The collective gaze of 100 eyes felt like a physical weight, a spotlight pinning Clara to the floor. She felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, prickling wave of humiliation. Alistair Finch's smirk remained fixed, a grotesque mask of triumph, his eyes gleaming with the pleasure of a predator who has finally cornered his prey. He had won. He had reduced her to this, a public spectacle, a woman forced to grovel for his scraps. He expected her to break. He expected her to weep. He expected her to kneel for his money. Clara's gaze dropped from his face to the small, pathetic wad of green paper on the pristine white marble, a tiny, crumpled insult that represented so much: her desperation, her sister's health, her own shattered dreams. For a single, agonizing second, she did consider it. Her body tensed, ready to stoop, ready to swallow her pride for Maya. But then, something inside her, a core of strength she thought had long been extinguished, solidified into steel. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked up. She did not look at the bill. She looked directly, unflinchingly, into the eyes of Alistair Finch, and in that one long, electric moment, her expression shifted. The humiliation was still there, a fire burning deep behind her eyes, but it was eclipsed, consumed by something else, something so unexpected it acted like a slap. It was not anger, it was not fear. It was a profound, bottomless, and utterly devastating pity. Her look did not say he was cruel. It said he was empty. It said he was a small, hollow man, and that this pathetic display of power was all he had. This look, more than any shouted word, was the first blow. His smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, a tiny, involuntary twitch of confusion. He had expected tears or fury, not this quiet, complete condemnation. Then she moved. She did not stoop or grovel. She performed an act of supreme, defiant grace. She bent her knees, sinking into a perfectly controlled, elegant kneel, as if she were receiving a medal, her spine ramrod straight. She was not submitting to him. She was descending to the floor's level. Her hand, steady and pale, reached out, her fingers closing around the crumpled $100 bill. Alistair's smirk began to return, believing he had won after all, that her pride was just a momentary flicker. But she did not put the money in her apron pocket. She stood, not in defeat, but with the poise of a queen, the bill now hidden in her closed fist. She did not look at him again. She turned, her black shoes silent on the marble, and walked past his table, leaving him in her wake, a man suddenly and inexplicably irrelevant. Her eyes scanned the room, which had become a sea of captivated, unblinking faces. She found her destination. In a quiet, sunlit alcove near the window, an elderly couple sat. They were clearly not of this world. Their clothes were neat but dated, and they were sharing a single slice of tiramisu, their old, wrinkled hands clasped over the table, their faces etched with a lifetime of gentle love. They had been watching her, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and profound embarrassment for her. Clara walked toward them. The entire restaurant, a single, silent organism, followed her every step. The tension was unbearable. A string pulled so tight it was about to snap. She was breaking the script. She was taking his weapon, his act of humiliation, and turning it into something else, something he could never have anticipated. She was about to rewrite his entire story. Clara reached the small, sunlit alcove. The elderly couple looked up at her, their conversation about a shared memory halting mid-sentence. Their faces were etched with a kind, sympathetic concern, their eyes soft with embarrassment for what she had just endured. They likely expected her to pass by, to retreat to the kitchens to hide her shame. But Clara stopped, her presence a sudden, gentle interruption to their quiet anniversary. The husband, in his neat, threadbare suit, made a small, aborted motion to stand, a gesture of old-world courtesy. Clara gave them a small, genuine smile, a micro-expression of reassurance that was just for them, a stark contrast to the mask of pity she had shown Alistair Finch. Then, in the deafening, watchful silence of the room, she raised her closed fist. She opened her hand, palm up, revealing the tightly crumpled $100 bill. It looked like a piece of trash, a discarded mistake. Slowly, with the deliberate care of someone handling a fragile butterfly wing, she began to unfold it. She smoothed the deep creases one by one, her fingers working with a steady, reverent patience, as if restoring a damaged piece of art. The act was intimate and transfixing. She was uncrumpling his hatred. She was smoothing out his insult. When the bill was finally flat, a crisp rectangle of currency once more, she did not pocket it. She reached forward, her hand gliding over their half-finished dessert, and placed the $100 bill gently on the white tablecloth, right beside the husband's clasped hands. It lay there, stark and significant. The elderly man stared at it, his eyes wide with confusion. He looked up at Clara, his mouth slightly open, about to protest, about to ask what this meant. Before he could form a word, Clara spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was clear, calm, and carried with an effortless, perfect projection that reached every corner of the silent room, every strained ear. "Sir, the gentleman over there insisted on contributing to your beautiful celebration. Please, enjoy." She gestured with an open palm, a subtle, graceful tilt of her head back toward Alistair Finch. The lie was audacious. It was brilliant. It was a masterpiece of social warfare, a verbal judo throw that used his own aggressive force against him. The elderly couple's confusion melted into a dawning, tearful understanding. The husband's eyes glistened, and he looked over at Alistair, a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude. For a second, The room remained frozen in this new, stunning reality. Then, a single person at a table near the back began to clap. It was not a loud, boisterous sound. It was a slow, deliberate, respectful applause. Another person joined, then another, and another, until the entire dining room, in a single, unified wave, erupted in quiet, powerful, sustained applause. It was a sound of overwhelming approval, a collective judgment, a release of every ounce of tension Alistair had built. It was the sound of 100 people siding with grace over greed, and Alistair Finch, he just sat there, trapped at his table, the target of every eye. His face, which had been a mask of smug triumph, collapsed. A deep, dark crimson flush bloomed from his neck, consuming his face until he was beetroot red, a visible, physical manifestation of a shame so intense it was almost unbearable to watch. He had been publicly exposed, elegantly disemboweled by a single, perfectly chosen sentence. He was no longer the power player. He was the villain in a story that had just found its hero. The wave of quiet, sustained applause, that powerful, collective judgment, finally subsided. It did not fade away gently. It settled, replaced by a silence that was even heavier, even more potent, even more judgmental than the sound had been. The atmosphere in the Aurelia was now that of a courtroom, and the verdict had been delivered. Alistair Finch was left stranded in the wreckage of his own arrogance, the deep, dark crimson flush on his face a burning beacon of his public disgrace. Every eye in the room was on him, unblinking, expectant. He was a shark in a tank that had just been drained, flopping and exposed. He could not stay seated. That would be an admission of guilt and weakness, a cowering posture that would confirm his defeat. He could not, he realized with a jolt of panic, simply stand up and walk out. That would be fleeing the scene, an act of supreme cowardice that would follow him into every future boardroom, whispered about by the very people he sought to dominate. He was trapped, cornered not by walls, but by the quiet, unified judgment of his peers, a force his billions could not deflect or deny. His body made the decision for him, a jerky, involuntary lurch. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly, obscenely, against the pristine marble floor, the only sound in the dead quiet of the room. He stumbled as he rose, his movements clumsy, all his usual predator's grace gone, evaporated, replaced by the fumbling uncertainty of a man suddenly realizing he is no longer the most powerful person in the room. He was visibly flustered, his hands twitching at his sides, unsure of what to do with themselves, whether to smooth his jacket or hide in his pockets. He looked at Clara, who had turned from the now beaming elderly couple and was watching him approach. Her expression was unreadable, calm, composed, and utterly, terrifyingly in control. He walked the few yards to her side, each step feeling like a mile under the crushing, silent weight of the room's collective stare. He stopped a few feet from her, a supplicant approaching an oracle, his entire body radiating a tension that was painful to watch. His expensive suit, which usually looked like armor, now seemed ill-fitting, constricting, a costume he was drowning in. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, and he resisted the urge to wipe it, knowing the gesture would be another admission of weakness. He opened his mouth, but the first sound that came out was a dry, choked click. He, a man who could command stadiums, who could destroy companies with a single whispered sentence, was speechless. The power dynamic was not just inverted, it was shattered. The pieces reassembled into a new, unrecognizable hierarchy right here on the sunlit floor. She was the mountain. He was the gravel at its base. He tried again, his voice, usually a confident, resonant baritone, coming out as a strained, cracking whisper, barely audible but echoing in the silence. "I am so sorry." His eyes darted around, desperately looking for an escape, for a single ally, but found only the cold, watchful faces of the other diners, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. He forced his gaze back to Clara, the only person in the room who mattered. That was unacceptable. He was pleading now, his desperation palpable, his entire carefully constructed public persona disintegrating in real time, second by agonizing second. "Please." His voice broke entirely on the word, a pathetic, splintered sound. "Please, forgive me," he was begging. The billionaire, Alistair Finch, was standing in the middle of the Aurelia, begging for absolution from the waitress he had tried to destroy. The humiliation was total, a profound and complete unraveling, a spectacle no one would ever forget. Clara's calm, steady gaze held his. In her eyes, he found no triumph, no smug satisfaction at his downfall. He found only the same quiet, unshakable dignity that had been his target from the beginning. It was a mirror, and in it he was grotesque. She held the silence for a moment longer, allowing his public humiliation to settle fully upon his shoulders, a heavy, invisible cloak. Then she spoke, her voice as clear and steady as it had been when she had gifted his money to the elderly couple, a crisp, clean sound that cut through the thick tension. "Your apology is enough, sir." She paused, letting the words land with their full, devastating weight. "Respect was all I ever required." Alistair visibly flinched. An apology was not a transaction. It was a surrender, and it did not fix the gaping, bleeding wound in his public image. He was a man who solved problems with a checkbook, who bought compliance and erased mistakes with floods of cash. This simple, human interaction was a language he did not speak. His desperation escalated into a visible, fumbling panic. He reached into his jacket, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, pulling out a slim, alligator skin wallet that held his black, unlimited credit card. No, that is not. I mean, let me." He was stammering, the words tumbling out, incoherent and pathetic. He fumbled for his checkbook, a thin, platinum case. 10,000. "Is that what you want?" He looked around wildly, as if gauging her price from the watching faces. 20,000. "Please, just take it. Let me make this right." He was not offering a tip. He was offering a bribe, a desperate, clumsy attempt to buy his reputation back, to reset the narrative, to turn this humiliation back into a simple, crass financial exchange he could understand and control. He was offering to buy her silence, her complicity, her forgiveness. He held the checkbook out like a shield. Clara looked down at the platinum case, then back up to his frantic, pleading eyes. She did not recoil in disgust. She did not lecture him. She simply shook her head, a small, slow, definitive motion that was more powerful than any shout. "My dignity isn't for sale." With that, the transaction was over. The conversation was over. His power was gone. She turned, her back straight, her poise absolute, and walked away from him. She did not hurry. She glided across the marble floor, her sensible shoes making almost no sound, and disappeared through the polished wooden door that led to the kitchen and the staff's private world. She left him standing utterly alone in the center of the opulent dining room, his hand still outstretched, offering a fortune that had just been rendered worthless. The room watched him for another second, then, in a final, crushing wave of second-hand embarrassment, the other diners, one by one, awkwardly looked away. Back in his sterile, glass-walled office, 40 floors above the city, Alistair Finch was a lion in a cage of his own design. He stood at the window, not seeing the sprawling, godlike view of the city below him, but seeing only her. The Aurelia's warm, sunlit room was a ghost image superimposed over the cold, grey canyons of steel and concrete. He was back in his kingdom, surrounded by the trappings of his absolute power, his minimalist Italian desk, his silent, terrified assistants just outside the soundproof glass, the stock ticker on his wall bleeding green, but the victory of his day felt utterly, sickeningly hollow. The memory of the incident, of the applause, of her quiet, devastating pity, played on an agonizing, silent loop in his mind. He could not forget her. He could not erase the feeling. He was consumed, not by anger, though there was plenty of that, but by her impossible refusal. His world was built on a simple, immutable law. Everything and everyone had a price. You just had to be smart enough to find it. People were assets or liabilities. Problems were solved with a checkbook or a threat. He had offered her $20,000, a sum that would change her entire year, and she had looked at him not with greed or even temptation, but with that same placid, soul-searing pity. "My dignity isn't for sale." The words echoed in the sterile silence of his office, mocking him. It was a bug in the system, a piece of code that did not compute. It was illogical. It was, he felt, a lie. It had to be a trick, a more complex, long-term manipulation. She was playing a different game, one he did not yet understand. He had been publicly outmaneuvered, and he could not let that stand. This was not about her anymore. It was about his own failure to control the narrative, his inability to make her bend. He had used his ultimate weapon, a life-changing sum of money, and it had been as useless as throwing a stone at a fortress. He strode to his desk, his movements sharp and violent, and slammed his hand down on the intercom. His assistant's terrified, tinny voice answered in less than a second. "Yes, sir." He stared at the phone, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed. "Find her, the waitress from the Aurelia, the one from lunch. Clara, I want to know everything about her. Where she lives, where she's from, who her family is. I want to know every secret, every debt, every weakness. I want to know who she is." His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl, the sound of a predator refocusing its hunt. "And I want to know what she wants. Because in his world, everyone wanted something. And he would find her price, or he would prove she was a phantom." The report landed on his monolithic black desk less than 24 hours later. It was not a cheap, flimsy printout. It was a slim, hard-bound folder, delivered by a man in a sharp suit who did not make eye contact and disappeared before the door had even clicked shut. Alistair Finch dismissed his terrified assistant, sealing himself inside his glass cage, the silence of the 40th floor absolute. He had expected to find a story of petty, predictable weakness. Student loans, a gambling boyfriend, perhaps a small, easily exploited drug habit. He had expected a lever, a pressure point he could squeeze to prove his point, to force her back into the box he had designed for her. He opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, not the tired, composed waitress from the Aurelia, but a younger woman, her hair pulled back, her face luminous with passion, her hands a blur of motion over a concert grand piano. The name on the file was not Clara, it was Clara Ivanov, age 26. The lies had already begun, he thought, a flash of vindictive satisfaction. But the story that unspooled beneath the name was not what he had anticipated. Full scholarship to the Juilliard School concert pianist program. The file contained copies of reviews from her professors, words like prodigious, once-in-a-generation talent, breathtaking. She had been the star of her class, destined for Carnegie Hall, for a life of acclaim and adoration. And then, 3 years ago, halfway through her final year, she had vanished. No warning, no explanation. She just stopped. She walked away from a future that was a guaranteed golden ascent. This didn't fit. The defiant, proud waitress was not just a waitress. She was a ghost. She was a runaway genius. He turned the page, and the why hit him like a physical blow. The file contained another photograph. This one was recent, taken in the pale, fluorescent light of a hospital room. A young woman, barely 19, lay in a bed, her face pale and thin but smiling at the camera, her eyes bright with a familiar, defiant light. Maya Ivanov, her sister. The following pages were a cascade of cold, clinical data, a rare, degenerative genetic disorder, a prognosis that was a clinical, polite death sentence. And then, the money trail. He saw the name of a private, experimental clinic in Switzerland. He saw the astronomical, 6-figure cost for the trial treatments. He saw Clara's meager paycheck from the Aurelia and how every single cent, every last dollar and dime was wired instantly, automatically, to that clinic's account. He saw the debt, a mountain of it, accruing with horrifying interest, all in Clara's name. He saw her frantic applications for second, even third jobs, all declined. She was not just a waitress. She was a soldier. She was a high priestess at the altar of her sister's life, sacrificing her future, her talent, her entire identity, one 10-hour shift at a time, to buy her sister one more day. Alistair Finch, a man who had never sacrificed anything, sat back in his chair, the report heavy in his hands. He was stunned. It was a staggering, profound silence that filled his chest. This was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a strength so vast, so terrifying in its purity, that he could not even comprehend it. He had tried to humiliate a woman who was waging a war he could not even imagine. Alistair Finch stood alone in the absolute, sterile silence of his penthouse. 40 floors below, the city was a breathtaking, glittering carpet of 1,000,000 lights, a diamond-strung testament to human ambition and power, a kingdom he had conquered. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, which usually filled him with a cold, possessive satisfaction, now felt distant and hollow, a beautiful, meaningless illusion. The glass, which was meant to frame his dominion, felt like the wall of a very high, very empty cage. He was not looking at the view. He was seeing the pale, fluorescent light of a hospital room, seeing the luminous, passionate face of a woman at a piano, seeing the quiet, devastating pity in a waitress's eyes. The bound report lay open on his black marble bar, a stark, factual indictment. The darkness in the room, beyond the city's glow, was nothing compared to the unfamiliar, cold darkness that was blooming in his own chest. This feeling, this suffocating, crawling sensation, was shame. It was a foreign, acidic emotion, one he had always associated with weakness, with his victims, with the people he bankrupted and crushed. He had never, not once in his adult life, felt it himself. He had felt anger, he had felt boredom, he had felt the electric thrill of a hostile takeover, but never this profound, gut-wrenching wrongness. The memory of the crumpled $100 bill, his little piece of theater, his pathetic power play, now burned in his mind's eye. It was not just an insult, it was an act of grotesque, blind ignorance. He had tried to humiliate a woman who was living an epic of sacrifice. He had dangled his pocket change in the face of a queen who was quietly, diligently, moving mountains for her blood. The sheer, staggering scale of her strength, her silent, uncomplaining war, made his entire life, his billions, his power, seem like a child's game, a collection of shiny, useless toys. He saw himself, for the first time, through her eyes. Not a lion, not a king, but a small, cruel, and deeply, deeply poor man. She was richer. That was the thought that finally broke him. That waitress, with her worn shoes and her fake, polite smile, was wealthier in character, in love, in sheer human will than he could ever hope to be. His arrogance, the bedrock of his entire identity, did not just crack. It shattered, disintegrating into dust, leaving behind only this raw, exposed nerve of shame. And as he stood there, motionless, a silhouette against the glittering, empty lights of his city, the shame began to curdle, to shift, to morph into something else. It was a grudging, painful, and deeply unsettling new feeling: admiration. It was the most terrifying, disorienting feeling of all. Alistair Finch, a man who had built an empire on hostile takeovers and an intuitive, predatory understanding of leverage, now faced a problem he could not solve with his usual, brutal tools. He wanted to help her. No, it was more than that. He felt a deep, unfamiliar, and obsessive compulsion to fix her situation, to lift the impossible, crushing weight from her shoulders. It was not kindness, not as he understood it. It was a categorical imperative, a problem that demanded a solution, a broken thing in his world that he now felt responsible for. But he knew, with an absolute certainty that mirrored her own quiet strength, that she would never accept his help directly. If he approached her with a check, no matter the amount, she would throw it back in his face. Her pride, the very thing he had tried to break and now found himself respecting above all else, was an impenetrable fortress. A direct gift was an insult. A direct offer was a continuation of the power play he had already lost. He would be just another rich man trying to buy his salvation, and she would see right through it. The solution, then, had to be as elegant and as invisible as she was. It could not be a gift. It had to be a fact of the universe. It had to be a miracle. He sat at his vast, empty desk as the first, cold, grey light of dawn began to creep into his office, the city lights below finally fading. He did not call his assistant. He did not call his public relations team. He made 3 calls, his voice low, cold, and precise, the voice he used when he was moving billions of dollars, the voice that did not brook argument or failure. The first call was to his private wealth manager in Zurich, the second to his most ruthless corporate lawyer, the third to the chief administrator of the Swiss clinic. He did not ask. He instructed. He ordered the immediate creation of a new philanthropic trust, funded anonymously through a labyrinth of shell corporations, a ghost account that could not be traced back to him, his company, or any entity he had ever touched. He called it the Ivanov Grant for Genetic Research, a name that would mean nothing to anyone but him and, perhaps someday, her. Within 2 hours, as the city below woke to its usual chaotic noise, the thing was done. The grant was established, funded in perpetuity, with a single, immediate mandate: to cover the full, complete, and long-term treatment costs for one Maya Ivanov, effective immediately and retroactively, erasing her entire, mountainous debt. He hung up the final call. The sun was now fully risen, and a beam of pale, watery light fell across his desk. He felt a flicker of something. Not the hot, heart-pounding thrill of a successful acquisition, not the adrenaline rush of a corporate kill. He felt a quiet, clean, and profoundly steady satisfaction. It was the feeling of a complex machine, perfectly assembled, humming into life. It was a satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit or power or ego. It was the first selfless act of his entire adult life, and it felt, to his complete and utter shock, good. Clara's apartment was a world away from the Aurelia, a small, cramped, but fiercely clean space above a noisy street. The air, thick with the smell of old books and the faint, antiseptic tang of Maya's medications, was the only air she could breathe freely. Here, she was not a ghost in a uniform. She was a sister, a guardian, a warrior. Maya was asleep in the other room, the rhythmic puff of her ventilator a fragile metronome for their lives. Clara was sitting at her tiny kitchen table, a stack of white, windowed envelopes in front of her, the familiar, cold dread settling in her stomach as she prepared to do battle with the numbers. Then, her phone rang, its vibration a violent, buzzing intrusion on the quiet table. She did not recognize the number. It was long, international, a Swiss prefix. Her heart did not just clench. It seized, a cold fist gripping it tight. Calls from Switzerland were never good. They meant a payment had failed. They meant a treatment was being suspended. They meant the thin ice she was skating on was about to crack. With a trembling hand, she answered, "Clara Ivanov." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, speaking English with a precise, cold German accent. "Miss Ivanov, this is Heinrich Gruber from the administrative office of the clinic. I am calling to confirm a new funding protocol." Clara's blood ran cold. Protocol. That meant a change. That meant a cancellation. I do not understand. Did the last payment not go through? There was a dry rustle of paper on the other end. "No, miss. We are calling to inform you that an anonymous grant has been activated in your sister's name. It is called the Ivanov Grant for Genetic Research. Your account balance has been cleared. Your outstanding debt is 0. Clara's mind went utterly, terrifyingly blank. The words were just sounds, technical jargon that made no sense. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "What? What are you saying?" The administrator sighed, a small huff of impatience, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Miss Ivanov, your sister's treatment, all future treatments, all related medical care, are covered in perpetuity. The clinic will no longer be sending you a bill." The phone slipped from her grasp, held only by the tight, reflexive clench of her fingers. Her legs gave out. She sank onto the worn linoleum floor, her back sliding down the kitchen cabinet, the breath knocked from her lungs. A sound escaped her, a raw, ragged gasp that was half sob, half scream. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 3 years of terror, of sleepless nights, of skipped meals, of soul-crushing, relentless pressure, all vanishing in a single, impossible instant. Maya. Maya was safe. The weight, the mountain she had been carrying, dissolved. She wept, huge, body-racking sobs of a relief so total it was a physical agony. But as the tidal wave of emotion rec request Hazen 5, he did not deny it. He did not lie, or deflect, or hide behind the armor of his corporate power. He simply stood before her in the cavernous, silent expanse of his office and accepted her accusation with a stillness that was more disarming than any defense. The Alistair Finch she had confronted was not the arrogant, cold billionaire from the restaurant, nor the panicked, humiliated man who had begged for her forgiveness. This was a third, unfamiliar version. A man stripped of all his usual artifice, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like just clothes. He watched her pace, his expression unreadable, and when her tirade finally ran out of breath, he spoke. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual sharp, metallic edge. It was not charity. Clara's laugh was a short, bitter bark. Not charity. What else do you call it? You paid off my life. You erased my debt. You made my entire struggle meaningless with a snap of your fingers. That is the very definition of charity, Alistair. That is the ultimate act of a rich man proving he is a god. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. It was respect. That word, from his lips, was so unexpected it stopped her cold. Respect, she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. You threw money on the floor at my feet. You had me investigated like a criminal. And now you buy my sister's health, a transaction I explicitly refused, and you dare to call it respect. He took a step toward her, his eyes holding hers, and for the first time she saw no contempt in them, no pity, not even admiration. She saw, to her astonishment, something that looked like shame, something that looked like a genuine, painful confession. The kind I should have shown you from the start, he said, his voice raw. I did not understand. I do not. He faltered, the man of absolute certainty fumbling for words. I do not understand you, Clara. I live in a world of transactions, of leverage, of price points. You are not in that world. You sacrifice everything. Your future, your music, your entire life, for someone you love. You do it without complaint, without recognition. I sacrifice nothing for anyone. I build walls of money, and I watch the world from behind them. His admission hung in the air, a stunning, vulnerable truth. I did not do it to prove I was a god, he continued, his voice dropping lower. I did it because I had to. Because your fight, it made my entire life look like a joke. I wanted. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration. I wanted to learn how. I wanted to know what it felt like to do one thing, just one single thing, that was not for myself. Clara moved through the lobby of Finch Tower like a tongue of flame, a living, breathing, furious thing in a mausoleum of cold steel and polished granite. The air was different here, thin and silent, smelling of money and recycled oxygen. People in sharp, dark suits glided past her, their faces blank, their eyes never meeting hers. She was a disruption, a splash of raw, messy humanity in a world of sterile, calculated transactions. She did not care. Her worn coat was still damp from the rain, her heart a trip hammer against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat of gratitude, rage, and profound, terrifying confusion. She did not stop at the massive, intimidating security desk. She walked straight to the elevator bank, her eyes fixed on the illuminated numbers. A security guard moved to intercept her, his hand raised, his voice a low, authoritarian rumble. Ma'am, you can't. Clara turned her gaze on him. The sheer, incandescent force of her emotion, the white, hot certainty in her eyes, made him physically recoil. She did not speak. She did not have to. He simply stepped aside. The elevator ride was a silent, agonizing ascent, 40 floors of suspended reality. She watched the numbers climb, her own reflection a pale, determined ghost in the mirrored steel. She was rising into the heavens, into the lair of the god who had, with a casual, anonymous flick of his wrist, rewritten her entire life. When the doors whispered open, she was met with another silent expanse of white marble. A terrified-looking assistant, a young woman her own age, rose from a sleek, minimalist desk. Ma'am, you can't go in there, Mr. Finch's. Clara walked past her as if she were a shadow. She threw open the two massive unmarked doors to his private office. The room was vast. It was not an office. It was a statement. 3 walls were pure glass, revealing a god's-eye view of the city he owned. The 4th wall was black, empty. The only furniture was a single, monolithic black desk. Alistair Finch was standing at the window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the grey, cloudy sky. He turned slowly, no surprise on his face, only a quiet, weary expectation. He knew she would come. She marched across the acres of plush grey carpet, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the cavernous silence. She stopped 10 feet from him. "It was you." Her voice was not a shout. It was a low, shaking, furious accusation, ripped raw from her throat. "It was you, wasn't it? The call from Switzerland, the Ivanov grant. You paid for everything. You bought my sister's life." Her fists were clenched at her sides, her whole body vibrating with the impossible, warring emotions. The relief that was so vast it made her sick, and the anger that was so pure it was righteous. You had no right. He did not deny it. He did not lie, or deflect, or hide behind the armor of his corporate power. He simply stood before her in the cavernous, silent expanse of his office, and accepted her accusation with a stillness that was more disarming than any defense. The Alistair Finch she had confronted was not the arrogant, cold billionaire from the restaurant, nor the panicked, humiliated man who had begged for her forgiveness. This was a third, unfamiliar version, a man stripped of all his usual artifice, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like just clothes. He watched her pace, his expression unreadable, and when her tirade finally ran out of breath, he spoke. His voice was quiet, lacking its usual sharp, metallic edge. It was not charity. Clara's laugh was a short, bitter bark. Not charity. What else do you call it? You paid off my life. You erased my debt. You made my entire struggle meaningless with a snap of your fingers. That is the very definition of charity, Alistair. That is the ultimate act of a rich man proving he is a god. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. It was respect. That word, from his lips, was so unexpected it stopped her cold. "Respect," she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You threw money on the floor at my feet? You had me investigated like a criminal. And now you buy my sister's health, a transaction I explicitly refused, and you dare to call it respect." He took a step toward her, his eyes holding hers, and for the first time she saw no contempt in them, no pity, not even admiration. She saw, to her astonishment, something that looked like shame, something that looked like a genuine, painful confession. "The kind I should have shown you from the start," he said, his voice raw. "I did not understand. I do not," he faltered, the man of absolute certainty fumbling for words. "I do not understand you, Clara. I live in a world of transactions, of leverage, of price points. You are not in that world. You sacrifice everything. Your future, your music, your entire life, for someone you love. You do it without complaint, without recognition. I sacrifice nothing for anyone. I build walls of money and I watch the world from behind them." His admission hung in the air, a stunning, vulnerable truth. "I did not do it to prove I was a god," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "I did it because I had to. Because your fight, it made my entire life look like a joke. I wanted—" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration. "I wanted to learn how. I wanted to know what it felt like to do one thing, just one single thing, that was not for myself. Clara stood frozen in the vast, silent office, the echo of his raw admission. I wanted to learn how, hanging between them like a fragile, unbelievable thread. His confession had pierced her anger, but it had not healed the wound. It was, she thought, just a more elegant, more sophisticated form of control. He was still the billionaire, and she was still the problem he was trying to solve, a personal project he had decided to fix to make himself feel better. Her distrust was a cold, hard shield she had spent 3 long years building, a second skin she had needed to survive, and she was not about to lower it for a man who had, just days ago, tried to publicly destroy her for sport. Her silence was heavy, judgmental. She folded her arms, a small, defensive gesture, her gaze unwavering and cold. Alistair watched her, his brief, flickering hope visibly deflating as he saw her closed-off posture, the renewed steel in her eyes. He recognized that look. He had seen it across boardroom tables right before a multi-billion-dollar deal collapsed. His confession, his moment of genuine, painful honesty, had failed. She still saw him as a threat, a manipulator. He ran a hand over his face, the frustration returning, but this time it was not with her, it was with himself. He was a fool. He was going about this all wrong. He was still thinking in terms of gifts, of absolutions, of transactions. He was still trying to give her something. He had to change the very nature of the exchange. He took a deep breath, his mind snapping into the familiar, cold clarity of a strategist, the predator's focus returning, but this time the hunt was for a solution, not a victory. Don't accept it as a gift. His voice was different now. It was not the voice of a supplicant. It was the voice of a man making a proposal, crisp, formal, and devoid of the messy emotion from moments before. Clara's eyes narrowed. What else could it be? Accept it as a job. A job, she repeated, the word flat, suspicious. I am starting a foundation, Alistair said, moving away from her toward the wall of glass, putting a formal, professional distance between them. He was pitching her now. I have poured hundreds of millions into causes, art museums, universities, buildings with my name on them. It is all meaningless. It is legacy building. It is ego. You. You showed me what is real. The fight for one single life. The quiet, desperate, daily wars that people like you are fighting, while people like me build monuments to ourselves. This Ivanov grant, it is just the beginning. I am liquidating $500 million from my personal assets. I am going to create a new fund dedicated to covering the experimental and long-term medical costs for families who fall through the cracks. Families like yours. Clara's heart began to beat a different rhythm, a slow, cautious, and deeply painful hope. He turned to face her, his gaze intense, respectful, and for the first time, truly equal. Your family will be its first beneficiary. That is a non-negotiable fact, but the foundation is just money. It is just a pile of cold, useless cash without the right person running it. It needs a heart. It needs a mind that understands what this fight actually costs. It needs someone with integrity. He took a step toward her. I need someone who cannot be bought. I need you, Clara. The hospital waiting room, late that night, was a universe away from the sterile glass tower of Alistair Finch. There was no polished granite here, no silent, judgmental assistants. This world was painted in pale, institutional green, bathed in the unforgiving, humming glow of fluorescent lights. It smelled of bleach, stale coffee, and something underlying and metallic, fear. But it was also a place of profound, messy life, a place of stakes that were real and immediate. Clara sat not in a waiting room, but on a small, uncomfortable plastic chair pulled up right beside Maya's bed in the semi-private room. The flimsy curtain offered the illusion of privacy. Maya was awake, the color already returning to her cheeks, the constant, low-grade terror that had lived in her eyes for a year finally, blessedly, gone. The beep of the monitor beside her was no longer a threat. It was a steady, comforting rhythm. Clara had explained the entire impossible day, her voice low and hesitant, the words sounding insane even to her own ears. The fight at the restaurant, the investigation, the confrontation in his office, and finally, the offer. A foundation. $500 million. A job running it all. Maya listened, her expression unreadable, her thin hand holding Clara's tightly. "I do not trust him, Maya," Clara whispered, the confession a relief. "He is a man who breaks things for a living. He is cold, and he is controlling, and this feels like just another way to control me. He thinks he can buy the world, and he just proved he can. He bought us, he bought your health. He bought my silence. It feels dirty. It feels like a trap." Maya was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the pale green wall. When she finally turned to look at Clara, her eyes were not the eyes of a sick child. They were the eyes of someone who had lived on the precipice of death for 3 years, and they were sharp and they were clear. "He tried to buy you, Clara," Maya said, her voice weak but steady. "He tried with $20,000, and he failed. He did not buy you. He saw you. You were the one person in his entire, empty world who he could not break, who he could not understand. So he changed the rules of his own game. You are looking at this as his victory. But what if it is yours? You are so worried about him, about his motives, about his world. You are not thinking about the real people. What about the hundreds of other families just like us? The ones who do not run into a billionaire in a restaurant. The ones who are sitting in this very hallway right now, trying to decide between their rent and their child's medicine." Clara looked at her younger sister, truly seeing the wise, strong woman she had become in the crucible of her illness. A wave of love and clarity washed over her. Maya squeezed her hand, her small grip surprisingly strong. "You saved me, Clara. You gave up your music, your life. You gave up everything to drag me back from the edge, one day at a time. Your fight is over. You won, but their fight is just beginning." Her eyes bored into Clara's, full of a fierce, undeniable truth. "Now you can save everyone else. This is not about his world, Clara. This is your chance to make it yours. This is not his foundation. It is our foundation." Clara walked back into Alistair Finch's glass tower 2 days later. The sterile, silent 40th floor felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The fear and rage were gone, replaced by a cold, clear, diamond-hard purpose. She was no longer a victim entering the dragon's lair. She was a negotiator, an equal, walking onto a battlefield of her own choosing. Alistair was waiting, standing not behind his monolithic desk, but by the window, a sign of respect. She did not wait for him to speak. "I accept," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty room, his shoulders, which had been tense, visibly relaxed. He turned to her, a small, controlled smile touching his lips. "Good. My legal team will. But on my terms." Clara cut him off, her voice unflinching. His smile vanished, replaced by the familiar, sharp focus of a predator. This, he understood. This was a negotiation. Clara stepped forward into the center of the room. "1. I will not be a figurehead for your conscience. I will have total operational control as executive director. 2. I will not report to you. I will report to an independent board, which we will select together. 3. The Foundation's work will be completely transparent. Every dollar, every family, every decision will be public. And 4. My sister's grant is the first, not the last, and its structure will be the model for all others, not a special favor. She held his gaze, her entire life, her entire purpose, distilled into this one unbreakable stand. Alistair Finch stared at her, the silence stretching. She had not just accepted his offer. She had seized it, taken ownership of it, and rewritten the terms of his surrender. He did something she had never seen him do before. He laughed. Not a cruel scoff, but a short, sharp bark of genuine surprise and profound respect. Done, he said, extending his hand, not as a billionaire to a waitress, but as a founder to his new director. Their partnership began. The sterile boardroom, a place of cold billion-dollar decisions, was invaded by a new, radical element: humanity. Clara was a natural, a force of nature. She brought not just her intelligence, but her lived, painful experience. In meetings with lawyers and accountants, Alistair would watch, humbled, as she would slam her hand on the table, cutting through their jargon. "This clause is cruel," she would say, her voice ringing with an authority that came from truth, not money. "It forces a family to choose between food and medicine. Change it," and Alistair, to the shock of his entire team, would nod and say, "Change it." In return, he taught her his language. He sat with her late into the night, patiently untangling the complex webs of finance and law, showing her how to wield his money like a scalpel, not just a hammer. Clara was surprised. The man she had pegged as a sociopath was a brilliant teacher, meticulous, patient, and fiercely protective of their new mission. A tentative, unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of late nights, shared purpose, and endless cups of bad coffee. He was humbled by her compassion, realizing it was not a weakness, but a strategic, guiding intelligence. She was surprised by his genuine desire to change, to tear down his old, empty world and build something real in its place. 1 year later, the sun once again poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Aurelia, striking the same crystal glasses and illuminating the same pristine white linens. The room, however, was unrecognizable. The old, cold, hallowed silence was gone, replaced by a vibrant, joyous chaos. Laughter, bright and uninhibited, echoed off the marble floors. The air thrummed with purpose, with hope. The guests were a new kind of elite, a mixture of tuxedoed billionaires and society doyens mingling with top surgeons in lab coats, shy, grateful families, and researchers whose work was now, for the first time, fully funded. This was the first annual gala for the Maya Foundation, and it was not just a success, it was a revolution. Alistair Finch stood near the back of the room, intentionally by the grand oak doors he had once stormed through with such arrogance. He was a changed man. The transformation was not just in the visible easing of the hard, predatory lines around his eyes, or the way his shoulders, no longer squared in perpetual combat, were relaxed. The change was in his gaze. He was not scanning the room for weakness or advantage. He was watching, his entire focus, his entire world, narrowed to the small, elevated podium at the front. On that stage, bathed in a warm, respectful light, was Clara. She was poised, her hands resting lightly on the lectern, her face luminous. She was not the ghost in the uniform. She was the most solid, real, and powerful person in the room. She was giving a passionate speech, her voice clear and strong, captivating the audience without shouting. She spoke of the thin, terrifying ice that so many families were forced to skate on, the gap between a diagnosis and a cure, a gap not of medicine, but of money. She spoke of dignity, of how the Foundation's mission was not to give handouts, but to provide a foothold, to invest in human life as fiercely as men like him invested in a stock. Alistair listened, his heart a heavy, unfamiliar weight in his chest. He remembered, with a clarity that still burned him with shame, the last time he had watched her in this very room. He had looked at her, and with all his supposed intelligence, all his predatory insight, he had seen nothing. He had seen a function, a tool, a mirror for his own boredom. He had seen just a waitress. He looked at her now, at this radiant, commanding, brilliant woman who was effortlessly holding an entire room of power players in the palm of her hand, a woman who had built an empire of hope from the ground up in just 12 months. He did not see a waitress. He saw a leader. He saw the woman who had, with nothing but her own unshakable integrity, faced him down and won. He saw the woman who had not just saved her sister, but had saved him, giving his empty, pointless, hollow life a meaning he never knew was possible. He felt a surge of pride so intense it almost took his breath away. The gala's joyous, chaotic energy finally began to subside. The last of the families, their faces etched with a profound, disbelieving hope that had not been there 6 hours before, had departed. The surgeons and billionaires lingered, finishing their last glasses of champagne, their conversations no longer about the stock market, but about research grants and logistics, their voices energized by a new, shared purpose. The room was warm, filled with the beautiful debris of a successful, heartfelt battle. Alistair found Clara standing alone by the main floor-to-ceiling window, her hand pressed against the cool, dark glass, looking out at the park, now a quiet, sleeping void. He had waited, patiently, letting her have the final, quiet moments of her absolute triumph. He approached her, his footsteps silent on the marble, a stark contrast to the angry scraping sound his chair had made in that same spot 1 year ago. She turned, a small, tired, but deeply satisfied smile on her face. "What is next, Alistair? Another crisis to manage." He smiled back, his own expression one of quiet, almost reverent awe. "No, no more work tonight. Come with me." He did not touch her, but gestured with his head toward a small, unmarked wooden door near the front, a door she had passed 1,000 times as a waitress, a door that led, she assumed, to a utility closet. Confused, she followed him. He opened it, leading her not into a closet, but into a small, private alcove she never knew existed, a hidden pocket of the restaurant, soundproofed, with a single, curved window looking out onto the dark, sleeping city. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Just a quiet spot," he replied. He faced her, the city lights a distant, glittering backdrop, his suit, his power, all irrelevant. His gaze was intense, all business, all foundation work, gone. This was Alistair. "You were magnificent tonight, Clara. You commanded that room. You gave them a reason to believe." "We gave them a reason," she corrected, a familiar, ingrained reflex. He shook his head, a small, firm motion. "No, your heart is the engine. My money is just the fuel." He paused, a flicker of the old, awkward uncertainty she had seen in his office returning, the vulnerability of a man still learning a new language. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. "I have something for you." She tensed immediately, the old defenses, the old suspicions, rising like a shield, a scar tissue response. Alistair, I have told you, I do not want. It is not money, he said quickly, cutting her off, his voice gentle. It is not for the foundation. It is not for Maya. It is for Clara Ivanov. He held out his hand, palm up. Lying on it was not a velvet box, not a diamond ring, not a check. It was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key, ornate and solid. She stared at it, her mind unable to process the symbol. A key, she said, her voice small. To what? A new apartment, another office. His expression softened completely. You gave up your dream for your sister. His voice was so quiet she had to lean in to hear it. A raw, intimate confession. You gave up your music, the one thing that was truly only yours. I thought it was time you got it back. Clara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The one thing she had locked away in a dark room in her mind, the one part of her old life she could not bear to mourn because the grief was too vast. Her music. What did you do? It is a studio, he said, his voice full of a quiet, nervous pride. I had it built on the top floor of the old symphony building, the one overlooking the river. It is soundproof. It has a Fazioli concert grand. They say it is the best in the world. It is yours. There are no strings. It is just a room, a place for you to be you. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes, blurring the city lights into a galaxy of broken stars. She had wept in relief for Maya. She had wept in rage at him. She had never, not once, wept for herself. He smiled, a small, genuine, warm smile, and he did not try to touch her. He did not try to comfort her. He simply stood there, offering her back her own soul. She reached out a trembling hand and took the key. Its weight was impossible, the weight of 1,000 lost notes. How? She whispered, her voice thick. That $100 bill, he said, his voice now full of the old, quiet shame, the memory that would never leave him. That stupid, crumpled piece of paper. He met her tearful gaze. It was the best investment I ever made. It did not just buy a company. It did not just fund a grant. It led me to you. If Clara's story of unbreakable dignity and Alistair's journey of transformation moved you, please support us by giving this video a thumbs up and letting us know your favorite part in the comments. Your engagement is the fuel that allows us to bring these powerful stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, so you are always the first to know when a new story drops. And please, share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that your true value is not in your job title, but in your character. That one single, quiet act of integrity can be strong enough to shatter arrogance and rebuild the world. Thank you for watching.